So today our panelists will give more insights into this crisis in the wider context, helping us understand the motivations and causes, the current and potential responses by internal and external actors, and some perspectives from local citizens and suggestions for moving forward. So first I'll introduce Kurt Bassuener. He's co-founder and senior associate of the Democratization Policy Council, which is a Berlin-based think tank. He received his PhD at the University of St. Andrews in 2021 for his dissertation called Peace Cartels, Internationally Brokered Power Sharing and Perpetual Oligarchy in Bosnia and Herzegovina and North Macedonia. We also have Ismail Ćidić, who's president of the Bosnian Advocacy Center. He's a Duke University alumnus and a fellow at George Mason University, a researcher of international relations and foreign policy. We have Ivana Korajlić, who's executive director of Transparency International, the well-known anti-corruption agency. She's based in Banja Luka, Bosnia. She's focused on the issues of rule of law and anti-corruption. And finally, we have Jasmin Mujanović, who is a political scientist receiving his PhD from York University. He specializes in the politics of post-authoritarian and post-conflict democratization. His 2018 book, Hunger and Fury, The Crisis of Democracy in the Balkans, examines the persistence of authoritarian and illiberal forms of governance in the Western Balkans. He also has publications, including peer-reviewed articles in academic journals and numerous policy reports, as well as popular analyses in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and others. He also has a prominent social media presence, and you've probably seen him in various shows related to that. He was formerly an assistant professor at Elon University and currently a policy consultant for the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Dialogue Southeast Europe office and an advisory board member of the Kulin Initiative. So each panelist will have about 10 minutes for their comments, and then we will open it up for questions from the audience. If you do have a question for one or more of the panelists, please post your question in the chat. And then at the end, we will organize those questions and present them to the panelists. So I will turn it over to Kurt.
Well, thank you, Safia, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to try to keep my remarks brief because I know I see so many people here that I look forward to the discussion. I guess I'll predicate this by just saying we're in a deterrence failure right now that we're seeing unfold. But we've been on this trajectory for a very long time. This has been drifting in this direction since 2006. And you could pick any number of points on that curve. But by the end of 2006, after that election campaign, which was the most divisive seen since the war, we have been on this glide path where it was already evident that the idea of Euro-Atlantic enlargement as being an inducement to get Bosnia and Herzegovina's politicians to straighten up and fly right, to adopt reforms, to accept transparency, rule of law, that had evidently failed at that point. But we have still continued to invest in that policy despite its evident failure, which is why we're here. Part of that sort of produced the question that I had that brought me here to Scotland from Bosnia, where I'd lived 11 years, and initially to work for Paddy Ashdown, which was, is this something that you see in other power sharing agreements that are put together in peace accords by international brokers? And I think the answer is yes. I think Lebanon's another one of these. North Macedonia is too, though it's probably stealthier than some of the others. So the prime beneficiaries of what I call peace cartels, and Bosnia is a great case of one, have no incentive under the structures there to actually work for the benefit of their citizens. Zero. For the first decade after the war, the guardrails that were also included in the Dayton Peace Agreement, the enforcement tools, kind of forced them to stay in their lane. The International High Representative, and at that time, for most of that time anyway, the NATO enforcement tool. The presumption at that point, when I arrived in May 2005 in Sarajevo, nobody was afraid of a renewed conflict at that time, which was only 9 years in the rearview mirror by the time I got there. not because people had forgotten, but the presumption was that if anybody threatened violence, they would be stopped, if necessary, by killing them. That was presumed. It didn't have to be stated. That's what deterrence is. Deterrence is both reassurance of the overwhelming majority of people and intimidation of those who might want to challenge the peace. Now we're in a void. This is what a free-range peace cartel looks like. This is free-range Dayton. The Dayton incentives are allowed to operate without any restraint because we were the enforcement mechanism. You have umpteen constitutional court rulings that are not implemented, for example. So it demonstrates this is not a society under rule of law. What's really damaging is, we do have, because we demonstrated we had this, we had the ability to constrain the operators of this peace cartel. And the reason it's a peace cartel is not only are they a cartel of a common interest in keeping what they stole, remaining positioned to keep stealing, and being unaccountable both politically and legally. And they have a common interest, whatever their divisions amongst themselves are. They have a common interest in that. They have divisions over market share. They don't have divisions over the operating system of politics. So instead of constraining them, we're investing in the peace cartel right now, which is the perversity of this. And we have the ability to eliminate their ability to leverage fear or radically reduce it. The other tool, in addition to fear that they use, is patronage. Now, that patronage is extracted from their own citizens, but it's also extracted from us. And the threat of ending the peace is a great extraction tool. And it's being used right now. And so what seems to be on the chopping block to give Ćidić something over his threats to withdraw from the state, form an army, looks like it's state property. That seems to be what's being negotiated over. And prior to this, and still ongoing, the last big trip of Matt Palmer, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, who is now the special envoy for constitutional and electoral reform, was to give Ćidić something, because he and Ćidić were commonly threatening not to allow the elections to go forward unless Ćidić could be guaranteed the seat on the presidency. So we're playing let's make a deal with crooks. And everybody in Bosnian and Herzegovinian society can see this. And so the credibility of the West has diminished radically at the popular level. But what's pathetic is it doesn't matter that Johann Sattler, Eric Nelson, the American ambassador, fill in the blank, that their credibility at the popular level is pretty abysmal because their audience isn't in Bosnia. Their audience is in Washington and Brussels and so forth. So that's how you have a really terrible disconnect. We have never looked weaker since the end of the war 26 years ago. And an article that I wrote yesterday that was published yesterday in Just Security tried to underscore the way we're going about trying to address this. The American policy, a lot of us had hoped that the Biden administration would finally inject some realism and backbone into a transatlantic policy that was failing. The United States wasn't driving, but we didn't really try to take the wheel either of a European Union determined policy. Now we seem to have adopted the European Union's policy that throwing money at things is the best way to deal with incipient or entrenching kleptocracies in the entire Western Balkan region. And that's the way this open Balkan umbrella is being pursued. In theory, it's great. I have nothing against economic integration in the region. In the context in which it's being pursued, it's devastating. And it's basically investing in kleptocracies in the deluded idea that somehow this will wean them from the illiberal autocracies. But there are geopolitical challengers like China and Russia. No, we're playing the same game, and we're playing the same game in a way that they're always going to win, because they're always going to be better at being transactional than we are. So I'll leave with I'll wrap up with a quick point on the closest thing to an overthrow of a peace cartel that we saw was in the Western Balkans, a little further south in North Macedonia in 2017. It started in 2014, though, and it started within the society, civil society. The opposition only picked up the ball later when they saw there was something to work with. And Zoran Zaev was able to form a government in large part because there was a upwelling among citizens that were tired of institutionalized injustice. Sound familiar to those of you who are Bosnians? Unfortunately, he also demonstrated the enormous gravitational field of a peace cartel's incentives. He basically decided to adopt the former regime's rackets, former regime's partner, Ali Ahmeti, because it was an asymmetric duopoly there, whereas in Bosnia, it's a weird hydra. And while it's completely true that the European Union screwed North Macedonia and not opening the door after the name change, the things that were completely within the government's ability to control in terms of trying to deliver a justice dividend and clean up the system so there could never be another Gruevski, they didn't do. So that shows how strong those incentives are. So until you have a different operating system, a post-Dayton Bosnia, you're going to need a high rep and you're going to need a deterrent. And if we're not willing to invest in those, then you're going to have this centripetal forces continue to travel in this direction. And ultimately that will end bad. So I'll wrap up my remarks there. And I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kurt. Appreciate that. All right, we'll turn to Ismail Ćidić.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us today. Kurt presented some great, I would say, technical analysis. I would provide a more ideological background of what's going on right now in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So some of the internal reasons and background of the crisis, where it's coming from and why now, as well as how Dodik used different mechanisms to get to this point. So in the immediate post-World War II Germany, as we know, the Allies had a significant role, to say the least. They basically reformed the entire society, convicted, killed, hunted down the Nazi war criminals, designed school curricula, wrote books, etc. And they basically remained there until every single major route of Nazism was defeated. In Bosnia, on the other side, the international community, led by President Bush and President Clinton at that time, imposed arms embargo, did nothing to prevent the genocide in the first years. And when the only legal army, the Bosnian army, started to liberate the country, liberate the territory, the international community decided to react. And not only it was too late to react, but the international community basically rewarded the Serb genocidal project. My point here is, unlike in the case of Nazi Germany, genocide in Bosnia paid off. A few people went to jail, that's true, but their ideology is stronger than ever, I would say. And their project, most importantly, is alive. And in other words, the evil is not defeated. This is an important background for the understanding of the current political crisis and where it's coming from. And this evil genocide ideology, because it was not defeated, it's cause of everything that you're hearing about in the international media these days. That's, I would say, as simple as that. And now we come to Milorad Dodik, who is the architect of the latest crisis, the worst one, I would say, since 1995. Contrary to many opinions, Milorad Dodik was part of the machine in the 1990s. He was among those who raised their hands to form the parastate in 1992. He was also among those who supported the army of RS, the paramilitary forces convicted of genocide. In other words, he was part of the entire system. That's why I don't get those who are surprised by his actions. There's, I would say, nothing surprising about him or about what he's doing. He's just following his pattern of behavior from the 1990s. And also many people, both in Bosnia and abroad, I would say, underestimated Dodik and his actions, calling him a country bumpkin or seljak or divljak in Bosnian, who is only looking to stay in power. And I would say this is a fundamental misunderstanding of his position and of the roots of every single crisis. So moving on, I would say that Dodik essentially has one personal role. He wants to be perceived and praised as his predecessor, Radovan Karadžić, convicted war criminal. Karadžić established the Republika Srpska, and Dodik aims at making it independent. And he also understands that he may not go there, he may not achieve it, he may not achieve that goal, but he at least wants to be the one who paves the way for such a move for one of his successors in the coming years and decades. And with all that being said, we come to an important point. Dodik is a very, very pragmatic and realistic politician. Most importantly, he knows his strengths and weaknesses. Moving on, so he covers his weaknesses, I would say, by proven mechanisms. Number one, by paying other people to do the job he's not able to do. And number two, making connections with every possible ally. And doesn't matter if they are criminals like Strahe or world leaders like Putin or Steve Bannon, whoever. He is there to make alliances and friendships in order to fulfill his mission. I and many others in Bosnia, including Jasmin, who is part of the panel, have been warning for years that what he's doing in the United States with his lobbying activities is extremely dangerous. A couple of months ago, I published a report about his dangerous lobbying activities in the United States. Fortunately, it was picked up by all major media. And now people finally kind of understand better why that was so dangerous and why that was so important for him and for achieving his political goals. Basically, his tactics and especially rhetoric was born in this country, in the United States, by the paid lobbyists and other agents, including international law experts. And as my report shows, he spent at least $25 million on the lobbying activities in the United States. And to put that into perspective, in 2013, for example, Republika Srpska was 8th on the list of all spenders in Washington, D.C. on spending on lobbying activities. So on the top of the list, it's only countries like Qatar and United Arab Emirates, Germany, etc. And Republika Srpska as a non-state entity is 8th on that list. At the same time, he confused pro-Bosnian politicians that his lobbying activities are ineffective, so they do not become active in Washington. He was very successful in his mission. Right now in Washington, D.C., there's basically no major pro-Bosnian voice, while Dodik and Vučić too have a major presence in Washington, D.C. That's why it doesn't surprise that certain U.S. Officials and diplomats come to Bosnia with specific policy proposals that are basically taken from Dodik's and even at some point Ćidić's agenda. A lot more can be said about Dodik, but knowing my time is running out, of course, I'll briefly move to the very last part, which is also important to understand this crisis and any other crisis that's going to come in the following years. What Dodik is doing today, every major politician in Republika Srpska would do tomorrow. So if we look at SDS, if we look at PDP or whoever remains from the opposition parties in that part of Bosnia, they all share the exact same vision, and that is the independent Republika Srpska. That's true. The only difference is that Dodik wants to establish an independent Republika Srpska today, while Šarović or Borenović or whoever wants to do tomorrow. That's conclusion number one. Conclusion number two is this crisis may or may not calm down. I think it won't for the foreseeable future. But because the evil genocidal ideology that I referred to in the first part of my presentation was not defeated, when it should have been defeated in the 1990s, we will continue to have crises like this one. We will continue. And the actors may be different, people may be different, people in power may be different, but the mission is the same, and that is the independent Republika Srpska. And we should never forget that, and we should remain awake that this is their goal, because the independent Republika Srpska, secession from Bosnia, that means war. We all know that. And every single member of the RS government, including every single members of the Assembly of Republika Srpska, is a proven genocide denier, and that is officially on record. You can look it up. And most of them are also on record glorificators of war criminals, which all goes in favor of what I'm trying to connect here, is that what's happening in Bosnia today has a lot to do with what was not prevented in 1990s, and that's why we will pay the price in the coming years as well. Unfortunately, that's the sad reality of what we are witnessing today. It is upon Bosnians, it is upon our friends and allies, it is upon everyone who is interested in this particular issue to know this, to understand this, because if we do not counter such evil ideology, such actors who want to implement such ideology, then the consequences are not for Bosnia only. The consequences will be there for everyone in the Balkans, in Europe, and for the wider region as well. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ismail, for your comments. I'm excited to present Ivana Korajlić, who will give some additional perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I have to disagree with some of the previous points relating to the level of nationalism. I think that most of the politicians in Bosnia and Herzegovina use nationalism only as a tool to achieve their own political or financial or other goals and to establish their power even more. We live in a kleptocracy. We live in a state-captured society where political parties control everything. They gain votes by buying votes directly, either through public funds or through directly giving money to citizens, through buying their support through jobs. And they use their positions to basically ensure that they maintain in power permanently. And the nationalism is one of the tools. I don't agree that Dodik is a real nationalist. He came to power on a completely different agenda, supported by the US, portraying himself as someone who is a reformist, who wanted to arrest war criminals, who basically ran a campaign for people to report where war criminals were hiding, who basically ran a campaign to transfer the competencies of the army to the Bosnian level. So that is all tactics to establish power and to maintain power. The same is with this. He's been since 2006, when he again came to power. He's always used different crises and maintained them on the verge of escalation in order to achieve specific concrete goals. It was usually very obvious. When there was an investigation against him directly by the State Investigation and Protection Agency that arrived to the prosecutor's office, he then ran a campaign to cancel prosecutor's office in the court of Bosnia and Herzegovina because he had a direct personal interest. He blackmailed then other politicians with forming the government after the next elections, where he basically demanded for the foreign prosecutors to leave the Department for corruption and organized crime, not war crimes, but corruption and organized crime, because he wanted to make sure first that he is not under investigation and that he is not indicted. And then any other crisis, threats with referendum, the referendum that was at the end maintained, but that was actually a survey and was not actually published in the official gazette, was actually for the purposes either of elections or some other thing that he wanted at that point. What is different now is that he went further than previously. He he widened the scope of the promised transfer of competencies. So it's not just one thing, it's now many other things. And the end goal is not so clear. So this is why people take this crisis more seriously than any other threats before. I have to also say that the other parties profited from this kind of behavior as well, including the SDA, who basically sometimes had synchronized these pseudo crises with Dodik because it enabled them to maintain in power with this other side of nationalistic rhetorics. And also not to mention the processes that we've seen in the last couple of years. The international community basically picked this mandate for some reason to put more pressure when it comes to implementation of different reforms, including election reform. Even though there was more possibility to do it during the last mandate because of the different distribution of power. And now the RS is out of money as well. This is something that we have to keep in mind if we consider whether he will actually establish new institutions, whether he will actually initiate war or anything else, and that he desperately needs money. He desperately needs support, and he also is, even though the opposition is very weak, threatened by the results of the local elections last year. And again, we have a new crisis, and today they initiated basically these new materials to the assembly of the RS with this really horrible declaration about the constitutional principles, which basically says that Republika Srpska is a monoethnic entity only for Serbs, etc. It's very dangerous. It puts, I don't know, anyone who lives in the RS and who is not Serb has every right to feel threatened. But we have to keep in mind the realism of everything. They announce this is only the conclusions, and then the conclusions say that in 6 months the government is supposed to draft all these laws. It's not just these 5 or 6 laws. Basically, the consequence is to have at least tens of different legislations being amended, including the constitution of the RS. And all this is drafted in 6 months and referred to the procedure. And then it's already June, even if it happens as they expect. And then we enter the election campaign. So it is, apart from it being legally questionable completely and whether it can be done, in terms of time, in terms of what they announce, in terms of how they interpret the constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina, etc. And it is dangerous, but I do believe that he is always creating crises in order to keep them on the verge of escalation, because escalation is unpredictable. And he is, as you said previously, very pragmatic. He wants to keep things under controls and very predictable for him. But if it escalates, then it is very, even for him, he himself might find himself in a very strange position about what to do, how to fund all this, how to lose the part of the cake on the state level institutions as well, which is very important for them, etc. But also I have to say that, yes, I do agree that opposition presents that they have all these values, the same values, because they are afraid if they say otherwise, that, as what he always does, portrays them as traitors. And this is what loses them votes. We had completely different policies and behavior of SDS and PDP while they were in the government on the state level. And a lot of things managed to be done. However, now in this opposition with him accusing them constantly of, if they say that this is a wrong kind of policy, of course they are weak and cowards and everything else, but they always play by his rules. I don't believe that they actually want this to happen, because I don't think that nobody would know what to do with it. I don't think that opposition even wants to come to power. It's not in their interest as well, and they are too weak for that as well. But most importantly, I don't think that citizens want that. They don't care about it. They are frustrated with corruption. They are frustrated with weak economy. They are leaving the country constantly. Yes, they do succumb to this nationalistic rhetorics, but at the end, we have to keep in mind that votes that they get are bought or coerced. Most of the people who vote for ruling political parties rule for them because they have direct interest to vote for them. So we have to look at things from different aspects. Of course, this is very dangerous. Nobody wants this to happen. No, I don't think that he even wants this to happen, completely. Because what will be left for him after he achieves all this? How will he maintain power? How will he win the next elections? Because this crisis is the way of getting votes and achieving control. We will probably see that there will be some trade going on behind closed doors. He will, as somebody said previously, probably get the state property. And then we will avoid, this will be all calmed down. But then again, it will be pushed for some other reasons. And we then spin in this vicious circle year after year, because we are in this crisis for 15 years. This is, for us, this is nothing new. And unfortunately for citizens, it's nothing new. They don't take this seriously. But what might happen is the boy who cried wolf. So we will all sit relaxed. We will not take this seriously, but someone else will. And there might be an incident happening somewhere because people are traumatized still. People do fear this kind of rhetoric and these kinds of threats. And somebody will initiate a spark that might lead to further consequences that even Dodik didn't intend for them to happen. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much, Ivana. Okay, we'll have our last panelist, Jasmin Mujanović.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of my colleagues who made time to be here, and of course everyone who made time to listen to all of us. I'll try to be as quick as I can to open the floor to all the folks who I see are already furiously asking questions in the chat. The one thing that I would say, because I think we've had a kind of an interesting back and forth between Ismail and Ivana, which I think is actually very useful, and there's a lot of informative potential in the exchange that we've just heard. And I kind of take the position that I don't think, I don't think there's quite as much a divergence in the analyses that we've actually heard. And I would just kind of jump off of one of the last things that Ivana said, which is that we've kind of reached a dead end, which is to say that both Dodik and I think folks in Sarajevo and across the region realize that there's really nowhere else to go with this thing other than for him to rhetorically and practically and pragmatically pull the trigger, as it were. Where I depart perhaps is, to Ivana's point about, next elections, et cetera, I do think Mr. Dodik is setting himself up for a situation where there's not going to be any future elections, which is to say, I think he's essentially going for a kind of Transnistria model. I think he wants a situation where, he realizes that if he can push this thing all the way, if he can push this thing to a boiling point, if he can push this thing to a catastrophic scenario, that means permanent rule. That means permanent rule for Milorad Dodik. That means permanent rule for his family. And that means permanent rule for his inner circle, much as we have seen in any number of breakaway states, in particular in the kind of the post-Soviet world. And I think given the fact that all of this is happening in an international context where obviously we see sharp divergences between the United States and the EU, we see that the EU has no functional foreign policy apparatus in a meaningful sense of the term. We see that the EU is internally riven and divided, and that Mr. Dodik enjoys a significant degree of diplomatic cover, at the very least, from governments in Budapest, from the current government in Ljubljana, even Zagreb to some extent, and so on and so forth. I think he is someone who believes that, the kinds of scenarios that he's sketching out that once upon a time could have been unthinkable are at this juncture much more plausible. And also the other thing that I think really needs to be emphasized, and I think we've heard it on a number of occasions today, which is that Milorad Dodik is not a crazy person. He's not a lunatic. He's not irrational. I think he's supremely rational. And I don't think Mr. Dodik would be doing any of the things that he's doing presently unless he was convinced that there was a reasonable chance of success, and very specifically that success will be aided, assisted, and realized ultimately through direct or indirect support by the Russian Federation and the government of Serbia. Whether that means a kind of formal invasion, as it were, which I think is doubtful, it's more likely to take a hybrid shape, as it were. But I think he genuinely believes that he does enjoy that support from Moscow and Belgrade. Whether that is accurate, I think, is a different question. And that's something we can debate, but I think he's certainly convinced of it. Okay. That having been said, I wanted to offer about 3 or 4, I think, concrete policy directions that we can take to actually deal with the situation, because that is in many ways, that is the question over all of our collective minds, both folks who are in the international community and those of us who are Bosnian. So I think one very practical thing that needs to happen, and this is in a little bit, in a sense, a kind of rhetorical but also normative shift, is that both the US and European governments who still are actually committed to the cause of peace and stability in the Western Balkans, and clearly it's not all of them, it's no longer sufficient to just say that there is support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina. What specifically we need to hear is that there is support for the legitimate government authorities in Bosnia and Herzegovina to realize and protect the same. That is, there is support for the legitimate government authorities of Bosnia and Herzegovina to protect and maintain the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Very specifically, what we need to move away from is the model that the EU presently employs in Kosovo, which we've seen just a couple of weeks ago, where the government of Aleksandar Vučić rolled out tanks and planes and soldiers and APCs and all the rest of it. And the EU's response was essentially, one of both sidesism. This is also something that we hear very frequently in Ukraine. This is a catastrophic policy that will only embolden not just Mr. Dodik, but also actually potentially other actors in Bosnia who will again interpret this as the EU washing their hands and believe that they can create new facts on the ground. Secondly, I think in line with the recommendations that were recently made public of the previous High Representative of Bosnia and Herzegovina, that is Mr. Valentin Inzko, I do genuinely believe that the United States in particular should impose a very robust sanctions regime and an expanded sanctions regime, not just against Mr. Dodik and his inner circle, but indeed the entire governing apparatus of the RS entity, including all coalition partners of the government at this time. Given the fact that it is highly unrealistic to expect that the EU will follow suit, both because there is the absence of capacity and the absence of will, the United States should model its sanctions regime against Dodik, ideally perhaps in conjunction with the government of the United Kingdom, who also has the capacity to do this, essentially model their sanctions regime on what has previously been done with Iran, which is to say a sanctions regime that is so robust that it will effectively tie the hands of European governments and make it untenable and indeed illegal for them to deal financially or politically with Mr. Dodik and his government, and also tie the hands of governments in the region, including Belgrade, in their ties. I'm not naive. I don't believe that this will, tutto completo, cut off Mr. Dodik from financial support, in particular from places like Russia. Nevertheless, it is very important that we go after the funds that he keeps in places like Austria, Slovenia, and elsewhere. And this kind of sanctions regime would allow that. Thirdly, I think it's very important that the United States in particular communicates very clearly to the government of Belgrade that it views them as the architects and primary benefactors of Mr. Dodik, that it is the position of the US government that Mr. Dodik would not be doing any of the things that he's doing presently unless he enjoyed and believed he enjoyed the political, financial, and rhetorical, shall we say, ideological support of the government in Serbia, and that as such, in the event of a major security breakdown in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it would be the position of the United States that it would hold Serbia responsible for what is happening in Bosnia. I think it's well past time that we stop pretending this kind of cutesy game with Vučić that, he's not actually involved and there's, space between him and Dodik. This is bogus, this is hokum. And if we're actually invested in the idea of peace and security and stability in Bosnia, we need to speak to Dodik's political masters, the primary one of which is in Belgrade. Ideally, we would be able to have a similar open conversation with Mr. Putin, but obviously that is a lot more complicated. Nevertheless, if we address his Serbian counterparts, that will go a long way. The final 2 points. First, again, kind of relating to the first thing that I said, and we've heard some things about Mr. Palmer, the U.S. elections envoy. I think it's imperative that the U.S. and the EU both immediately cease with what appears to be their current policy, which is this decades-long idea that the path to reform in Bosnia and Herzegovina runs specifically through dividing what are known as the pro-BIH parties or the pro-BIH bloc, and then essentially seeking to accommodate the HDZ and the SNSD to one extent or another. This is catastrophic. This is exactly why Bosnia is in the position that it's in right now, because this has been the policy for decades. I mean, not only do these parties numerically represent the largest chunk of the Bosnian parliament, they are also the parties that espouse and embody the purported values of the European Union and the Atlantic community. So on what planet it makes sense to take your closest ideological allies, subjugate them so that you can accommodate parties that are beholden to autocratic regimes like Serbia and Russia to enact reforms in Bosnia and Herzegovina is truly beyond me. This is completely backwards, and it's extraordinary to me that we still have to have this conversation, but here we are and we have to have the conversation. Finally, as a kind of long-term perspective, and something that should ideally inform strategic thinking in both the EU and the US, given the fact that European Union membership is very clearly off the table, not just for Bosnia, but for the region as a whole, it is very important that the US, I think, moves towards some kind of functional decoupling from this mythos of EU enlargement, and that the United States in particular reinvests itself in NATO enlargement. NATO enlargement is still a difficult sell in many ways, in particular in places like Bosnia. Nevertheless, it is far more plausible and conceivable than EU membership. And also it offers a very concrete and strategic posture, both for the alliance, and also offers something very, very critical for Bosnia and Herzegovina itself, which is, of course, that it would fundamentally lock in the country's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and also create the framework for future political evolution within a normal democratic context, where if you know that basically the threat of foreign invasion is off the table, we can have meaningful, peaceful conversations about all kinds of long-standing structural reforms. So there was a big scattershot list, but I wanted to get through it fast to leave as much time for people in the chat. So thank you, I'm done.
Thank you, Jasmin, and especially to all the panelists as well. We heard some great comments and lots of some of the debates that we're familiar with in terms of thinking about causes and motivations for Dodik's actions, right? Ideological, pragmatic, a combination of both. Lots of interesting policy suggestions for international actors. So I'm going to go straight to the chat and go basically in the order of where I find a significant question. So I'll start with 2 questions that Matthew Simonson raised. He says, in the US, we're merciless on politicians who dare to change their ideology, calling them unprincipled flip-floppers. Is this not an issue in Bosnia? How has Dodik been so successful at shaking off his past as a pro-unity moderate. And Matthew has a follow-up question about he asks, what are the chances that Ćidić or Ćović overplays his hand and accidentally sets off violence this coming year? So those are the two from Matthew, if anyone wants to jump in with those. Ivana, just go ahead. Oh,
yeah.
Kurt, Ivana, whoever.
No. Go ahead, Ivana. Please go ahead.
No, okay, thanks. Well, first, yeah, how did he manage? Well, people have a very short memory here for some reason, especially the voters. So there wasn't so much point in explaining to the voters why he completely changed the ideology and his approach. He basically realized first that it's easier to win votes with this kind of story, also to create crisis on this kind of threats, and also as a leverage against the international community, which is very important, because this is what the international community is scared most, that someone is going to start a conflict again. So wherever there was a point in negotiations that he basically wanted to strengthen his position, he would push with these kinds of threats. And for the people, they don't really sanction any kind of bad behavior here anyway. As I already mentioned, they know that he's corrupt. They know that he's an autocrat. That they know that SNSD functions as a mafia organization, basically. But they still kind of vote, either in short term, with there's a crisis, he will defend Republika Srpska because he portrays himself as Republika Srpska, basically, or there is, as I already said, direct interest or incentive for them to vote. But I also wanted to mention, because Ćović is another player that I don't think that we mentioned enough previously, also as someone who is destabilizing factor here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and especially with the threats that they will block the elections basically next year if the amendments to the election law are not based on their wishes for the House of People particularly, and also for the member of the presidency. And not to mention the role of the US and the EU in these reforms, basically appeasing to his own interests and HDZ interests. But what might happen is, with all this crisis going on until elections, and then nothing happens with the election reform, Ćović again also blocks the elections, and we have what Jasmin says, a situation where there will be no elections, and the situation which is basically suitable for any party which is in power now, I think, including SDA, because the opposition for them is also strengthening in the federation.
Yeah, jump in.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I mean, I think something, I want to give some potential positive here, and it's only potential. But I think that since 2013, increasingly, people have been more willing to stick their necks out, despite all the countervailing forces of patronage jobs, being afraid Uncle Jovan will lose his job in any public service if you don't vote for the powers that be, so half the electorate stays home. And the most recent one was the sort of cross-pollination between the Justice for David and Justice for Jenan movements, which was unprecedented, sort of. So I think there's at the popular level, I'll go so far as to say, I think at the popular level, Bosnians and Herzegovinians of each self-described stripe are more capable of being civilized and decent to each other than Americans are right now. I know that structurally it's different, but I think the structure is the issue. But that's the perversity of our policy, is that instead of constraining the powers that be in Bosnia from being able to subjugate them and reduce people's dignity, which is driving the population out of the country, of every self-description, we are buying into their cartel because it's easier. This is the low road. To Mr. Simonson's question about Ćidić, Dodik's original sale in 2006 was essentially, I could keep what they stole better than they can because I'm not from the party that brought you Srebrenica, and they can't lean on me that way. And Ivana's absolutely right. Corruption, nobody's fooled by corruption because they know that's why people get into politics. It's a for-profit enterprise. Yeah, when we talk about anti-corruption, we think that, oh, if you have this suite of laws, that you're gonna root it out. It's the main course. It's not ancillary to politics. It's the business model, and we don't want to take it on. I just heard recently from people I trust that there's this project that the European Union delegation is doing called People's Assembly, where they're picking people by sortition. Originally, that was supposed to be about corruption, but there was no interest in the EU delegation to have the topic be corruption. So lo and behold, it became about the election law and constitutional reform. So it's an astroturf exercise. It's all bullshit. And so the point here is that the danger of miscalculation is still very high, even though there is no popular upswelling for violence. There wasn't a popular upwelling for violence in 1992 either. That came from above. And that's why it's so dangerous, because they need to do that to stay in power. And thanks. I'll leave the floor for others.
Did you want to jump in real quick, Jasmin? Because there's a question.
Just very quickly, because I see it's I see it's also a conversation that kind of keeps coming up. And I mean, just pulling something out of what Kurt and Ivana have said, and it's also something that was reflected in Ismail's presentation about the lobbying. One of the understated factors in all of this is actually the extent to which Ćidić has become embedded, and his people have become embedded in Western power structures. It's difficult to overstate the amount of essentially cohabitation that exists between people in Ćidić's circle, both specifically his circle, and then also via the establishment in Belgrade and within the EU. And so when we're thinking about, all the various myriad crises which are affecting the European Union and kind of the broader notion of Western democracy, Mr. Ćidić and his government are a small but especially pernicious example of internal erosion. And so when we're thinking about things like sanctions, and one of the greatest lies ever told is this idea that EU governments can not themselves enact sanctions. They can. It is a big ask, but they can actually do it themselves without having to go through the EU. This actually is possible. And this needs to be emphasized, because what Ćidić and his people represent is an assault, not just on the rule of law, peace, and stability of Bosnia and the Western Balkans. It's an assault on the rule of law of these countries themselves. Because if you can allow somebody like Ćidić, who I remind you won, 350,000, 370,000 votes at the last Bosnian elections, this man would be a village alderman, numerically speaking, in a mid-sized European city. Right? So he does not have a tremendous power base. This is a small country, a small region, a small political movement. And the fact that it has been allowed via its networks with people like Orban and Vučić and Putin, et cetera, to spread this toxin into the European Union, that should be a national security concern for the governments of the European Union and NATO themselves, never mind what their policy is specifically to Bosnia-Herzegovina. And once we start having that conversation, how your national security interests are embedded with Bosnian national security interests, then we can make some progress in Bosnia.
Thanks. So I want to, because I know that Ismail has to leave in a few minutes. So there was a question specifically for him by Burak that I want to read. It says, having in mind that Erdogan is one of the autocratic leaders who has interest in the region, says Ćidić visited him in the aftermath of his meeting with Orman and Janša, and stated, I think he's meant Orban, and Janša, and stated that he believes the three-partite meeting between Croatia, Serbia, and BiH might be a good idea to find solutions to the problems of Bosnia. Do you think Turkey or Erdogan has the capacity to find a golden middle between these actors?
It's ironical that after all these efforts made by the United States and the European Union over the last couple of decades, that Erdogan is probably now in a position to have a much stronger influence in Bosnia than these countries. But at the same time, Erdogan is now in a position to question himself and his position, whether he would go in favor of the Bosniaks, pro-Bosnian side, or he is going to kind of continue balancing between all three or all four sides. Over the last years, Erdogan managed to position himself as someone who, yes, he is leaning towards the pro-Bosnian side, but he has a very good relationship with both leadership in Serbia and Republika Srpska. For the first time in several years, he has to determine whether he would completely lean towards one side and leave Serbs on the other. I'm not sure that he is in a position to do these kind of moves at this moment, at this particular moment, but at the same time, I'm not ruling out the possibility that he does that in case Dodik really continues with his secessionist moves, and if he really continues to undermine the constitutional order of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I know Erdogan has been doing a lot of these things with Serbia as well, including this proposed meeting of three big brothers, Croatia, Serbia, and Turkey. This geopolitical maneuver, I think, would not work and will not happen precisely because of leaders of Bosniak parties, but also because of Erdogan, because I think it's a very, very dangerous move in which Turkey might endanger their interests, and not to mention what will happen to the Bosnian side in case that happens. But also that's very interesting in the way how it was structured and positioned, knowing that and the way how Dodik presented it. Okay, Serbs in Serbia are going to kind of cover Serbs in Bosnia, Croats in Croatia would cover Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina, while Turks in Turkey would cover, and you can determine your own conclusion, Turks in Bosnia, which is a very known Islamophobic agenda, again, from the 1990s. So I'm not sure that's going to happen. And stronger moves by Erdogan will follow only in case Dodik continues with his precise secessionist moves.
So thank you. So we had two questions that I'm trying to go in order to give preference to those who asked earlier, but we do have a lot going on there. So one by Albert and another, I think, below that. Albert says, could the American handling of the Afghanistan withdrawal be leading to Washington's reticence to overtly act in Bosnia, or was this going to happen anyway, given how the US envoy currently leading negotiations wrote a self-insert novel of himself, quote, fixing Bosnia? So that's that one. And I just want to add one more by Kemal. How is it possible for the OHR to transition from the hands-off Schwartz-Schilling model to a model closer to that of Lord Ashdown? Would it require a revamped and re-energized NATO mission in Bosnia? So those are two. Who wants to answer those? Briefly, please, because I'm looking at the time and we have a lot of questions.
I think I'll answer very quickly, and then I see Kurt also definitely will have stuff to say on this point. So I think in terms of, how do we shift, I think not just the position of the OHR, but more broadly, because the reality is, folks who follow my work know that I've been extremely critical of both Mr. Christian Schmidt himself individually and the manner in which he was appointed. I think it was just a complete boondoggle, and there is not sufficient time for me to be as critical as I would like to be, in particular of the German government in its handling of the situation, because really fundamentally it cannot be overstated the extent to which they did tremendous damage to Bosnia and the country's stability. And this needs to be acknowledged, and they need to be named, which is why I think many of us are so hopeful that there might be any kind of departure from sort of what was the Merkel era foreign policy, not just towards Bosnia, but the region as a whole, with any new government in Berlin. So that having been said, I think given the divisions that exist within the European community and the Atlantic community, I think this is where it becomes so important for, I use the term semi-ironically, but basically a coalition of the willing. Among value-oriented and value-informed democracies who really genuinely do want to see progress and reform and a move towards a functional liberal democratic regime in Bosnia-Herzegovina, no matter how sort of distant that prospect may seem, for them to get together and start making policy jointly. I still remain optimistic that there is enough residual capital and diplomatic know-how in the Biden administration to do that. I think the United Kingdom represents a tremendous opportunity at this juncture to do that. I think we've heard some of the most constructive international commentary and analysis of the events in Bosnia, specifically out of the United Kingdom in the last few days. We'll see what happens with Germany. But again, this is another situation where some of these smaller actors should not be understated. You know, countries like the Netherlands, countries like Italy, countries like Canada, even countries like Japan. These are the countries that can be put together to advance collective action at things like the Peace Implementation Council, but also at other relevant international fora. And so this is a model that I think we should nurture, and that folks who are in perhaps some of these various countries, I don't think we have anyone from Japan, but who knows, you know, that's the model for the future, essentially, because I think this idea of kind of collective action of like, what can the EU do? There is no more EU. I mean, from a functional foreign policy apparatus standpoint, there is no EU, because the EU is beholden to people like Viktor Orban. And until that changes, it's very difficult to imagine any kind of comprehensive European level policy, unfortunately, but that's where we are.
Very quickly.
Just very quickly, you need, when the High Representative was powerful, you had the enforcement tool of the credible deterrent force on the ground too. I agree with Jasmin that you could get a coalition of willing. I don't have the faith in the Biden administration, judging from what we've seen, that there's any will to kick it up to the level that it would take to turn the policy around from it being steered in the wrong direction. The point on legislatively, you've had people across the Atlantic, Congress, the House of Commons, as Jasmin mentioned, and members of the European Parliament be leading on this. At the executive level, we're nowhere across the Atlantic. No member state government is willing to defy this. And the hub to create critical mass of a coalition of the willing is the United States. So until that's turned around, it doesn't coalesce, because nobody else is going to lead, I fear.
All right, I'm moving to Bruce Burton, and Ivana had a couple questions. Bruce asks, BIH seems to constantly lurch from crisis to crisis, and this is certainly not the first one, as we've talked about in this panel. He wants to know a little bit more about what makes this different. And also leverage. Jasmin has spoken very specifically about the US, and he's asking about possible points of leverage against Dodik. And then Alana says, are there smart sanctions that could hurt Dodik and the nationalist side, but exempt the general population in the RS? So those are two you can tackle.
Well, yes, that was supposed to be one of my initial points, but I forgot about that. The issue of sanctions, I mean, everyone is talking about it now, what types of sanctions are at the disposal of different governments, etc. And there was also, you know, again, you see that there will be sanctions against the whole of RS, etc., which I think would send a completely wrong message in this kind of situation, and would have damaging consequences, since it could escalate things even more. First of all, the other thing is that why should all the citizens suffer for something that one group of politicians is doing? And even though they elected them, of course, they need some kind of incentive to stop voting for these guys. But if we saw that people didn't actually learn from this during the 90s, when they suffered under sanctions and everything else, but they still kept, even after that, voting for some of the same politicians who just, you know, changed the names of the parties, etc. So I think that this should be focused. Personally, of course, we saw that in the case of US sanctions against Dodik, it didn't work because he didn't have much to lose in this case. He didn't have property in the US or anything else. But if it should be extended to the members of the family and people who are directly financially connected, like the companies who are also getting contracts through corruption, etc., then this can send much stronger message. But this must be followed by other countries as well. I mean, EU is the most important here, but it is, we've seen so many times, you know, the how it works and the lack of consensus and everything else. So it's up again on the individual members to use their own mechanisms that exist. But to keep in mind that, you know, there shouldn't be every company in the RS sanctioned for this, because we've seen the loss in the economy because of the taxes and everything else. People just, you know, move the company from the RS to the Federation. So it's already been going on for years. So for this reason, it needs to be very targeted and it needs to be carefully constructed, not in order not to basically make a martyr of these people, because they can make themselves martyrs, because they can say that all of the West is against them or whatever. We've seen it before. So it needs to, the messaging needs to be very clear, and it needs to be targeted on the people who are responsible, individuals who are responsible, and their allies.
Okay, should we move on, or did anyone else want to add to that? No? Okay. Jasmin? No? Okay. We have a question from Ayla, who wants to know kind of a big picture question about the future for BIH. What kind of path do you see? You know, I might add to that, you know, in terms of Dayton, a lot of you said that, you know, Dayton, as long as we're stuck with the structure of Dayton, we're going to keep having these crises and lurching from them. So she sort of asks what kind of path you would suggest that they might follow. How could they achieve it? And she says, what do you consider is the most effective contribution to your society that your government, I assume from the governments that you all, societies that you're in, have employed? And what is efficient as an activism?
So I'll just very quickly answer the second question. I think there was a very important initiative that came out over the last couple of weeks, where there was a kind of joint diaspora letter in the United States written by members of the Bosnian, the Kosovar, Albanian, and Montenegrin diaspora communities, addressed to American policymakers on the Hill as well as the administration. I think this is a really interesting model of activism that is something that I would like to see replicated at the European level as well. The reality of the situation is, when we're thinking very pragmatically about the state of things in the Western Balkans right now, we have pretty much Serbia on one side. It has now a somewhat closer relationship with the governments in Skopje and perhaps Tirana to some extent, and then pretty much everyone else on the other side. Croatia and Slovenia are sort of in its own little world because they're meshed in the EU and NATO, but Serbia has has been destabilizing and involved in very problematic ways in the internal politics of Bosnia, Kosovo, and Montenegro. So I think, it's very important that folks in the diaspora start building better and stronger links among other like-minded diasporas, and also that they start politically activating themselves in a more meaningful sense of the term. The Bosnian diaspora, for instance, is a tremendous kind of reserve of political, economic, and even diplomatic capital that largely remains untapped. And this diaspora is also where we see some of the strongest and best and most pragmatic forms of inter-ethnic solidarity, shall we say. A lot of the folks that might be, whether they're Bosniak, Serb, Croat, or whatever else, these are folks who still have a vision of Bosnia-Herzegovina as a more liberal, tolerant, and cosmopolitan place. And so that's something that I really think we need to do a much better job of tapping into. The other thing is, I have to say, I'm very categorical and I'm very ideological about one fundamental point when it comes to Bosnia and its future. The only functional future that Bosnia has is as a liberal democracy. And I know when I say that, people scoff and they roll their eyes and they laugh and they do all kinds of stuff. I haven't seen any gymnastics erupt, but I'm sure it's happening. A lot of you have your cameras off. What I mean by that very specifically is we have a very perverse and toxic idea about what what compromise means in the context of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And we have a situation where, because the nationalist parties are so extremist and are so far to the right, we believe that compromise with them is what we should be after. And by definition, compromise with parties that are so to the right means that you're still going to end up somewhere on the far right spectrum, which of course will just precipitate a different kind of crisis. I mean, we see that very clearly in what we understand to be the current primary electoral reform model that Mr. Palmer appears to have kind of shopped around in Bosnia, which is this so-called Fula formula, which is just, I mean, suffice it to say, it would be struck down at the European Court of Human Rights. And I can't think of a worse situation for Bosnia-Herzegovina than the US and the EU to have brokered electoral reform, and then for that reform to be struck down at the European Court of Human Rights. So what you have to move to, at least at the normative rhetorical level, on the part of the United States and the European Union, is to say, look, the only way that this country is going to function is by beginning to move towards a functional liberal democratic model like every other functional democracy on earth. How long it takes you to get there, what steps you have to take, and what kind of particular accommodations you have to undertake to, still accommodate the various peoples and communities that call Bosnia-Herzegovina home, and hopefully will continue to call it home for many, many centuries in the future. I don't know. But that's the model that we have to move towards. And are there multinational, multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious democracies that we can model ourselves on? Yeah, practically every single one of them in the European Union, for instance, as well as most of them in NATO. So the idea that this somehow is not the compromise solution, the very thing that has created the modern world, liberal democracy, free market capitalism, et cetera, and that Bosnia is the one country where we're not going to apply this model and we're going to find some kind of ethno-sectarian quasi-apartheid model that's going to be functional. I don't understand what the vision is. I don't understand what the payoff is if we're not moving towards the one thing that we know creates prosperous, stable, and safe societies. So at the very least, at the normative and rhetorical level, I really do believe that we need to lean hard into that vision, because that is categorically one of the things that we are missing, not just in Bosnia, but in the region as a whole. We are missing vision. We are missing someone to say, this is what it could look like in 50 years. This is what it could look like in 25 years, et cetera, et cetera.
I'll jump in. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I was saying, go ahead and jump in, because I see.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's a very good question. I mean, maybe it's very Leninist of me, and I'm not a Leninist, but I mean, one of the only potential silver linings here is that now Bosnians and Herzegovinians, of however they describe themselves, know that they're on their own. Effectively, they don't have any state friends. And for so long, there's been a sort of cargo cult. Let's model ourselves on the Aquila. Ultimately, the citizens of that country have to decide what they want instead. Everybody's disgusted with these guys. If there was a referendum to send them to Goliotok, which was where Tito sent the common formists after 1948, 95% of the people would vote yes. Yours, mine. The Lebanon chant, all of them means all of them, would work very well in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I have no doubt of that. But the problem is, and this is where Jasmin was here speaking, our policy presents them and treats them like the avatars of their people that they claim to be, which gives them more mojo. And we treat that as legitimate, even though we have lots of evidence it's not true for every one of them. So to your second question, the best thing that happened after Dayton that the US government did was to push the direct election of mayors. Because then you have a direct constituency and you have somebody to name. Above that level, you don't have it. It doesn't exist. Nobody's responsible. Therefore, you can't hold anybody accountable. So I would think that should be the fundamental building block of a democratic society, is more decentralization of a lot of government and centralization of the services that everybody's really complaining about, like health and so forth, that people have. We've seen how this has been corrupted by the system viscerally in the COVID crisis.
Okay, well, I see we're at 2:16, so there is like 1 or 2 more questions we could ask if you guys want to, but we can also end as we said we would. Does anybody want to?
I would just say one thing very quickly. Yeah, I'll just make a final point. And you know, this is coming from a very personal place, and my colleagues Ivana and Kurt may not necessarily agree with me, but you know, I really am very concerned. You know, we've had a robust freewheeling discussion, but I'm very concerned, and if for no other reason, I'm concerned because of something very astute that Ivana said, and that is that in the current climate of fear and anxiety that is being produced, the risks of miscalculation are rising exponentially. And I remind you that of the 140 to 150,000 people that died in all of the Yugoslav wars, so Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Kosovo, even what is now North Macedonia, fully 100,000 of them were killed in the war and genocide in Bosnia and Herzegovina. You know, the scale of violence in Bosnia was on a different level, as was the scale of the atrocities. And the level of trauma and resentment that has been engendered by the war and the post-war compact is tremendous. In a situation where cooler heads do not prevail, and there is some kind of argument, potentially even between individual, for instance, police officers along the inter-entity boundary line, between state police and RS police, between a border guard and an RS, you name it. And God forbid a weapon is discharged. God forbid someone is killed. In this current climate, the potential for something like that to spiral very quickly out of control, and for militants on every possible side to basically take the situation into their own hands, even outside of the very toxic and pernicious purview of people like Ćidić and Dodik and others. It terrifies me. It genuinely terrifies me. So if you're somebody who's been paying attention to Bosnia for a long time, whether you're in the US, the UK, Germany, Netherlands, Italy, wherever you are, this is one of those times where it makes a difference for you, not just to keep paying attention, but to reach out to your own local representatives and say, hey, can we pay attention to Bosnia a little bit? Could you please just look into this? Could you bring it up in Parliament? This is where it really genuinely matters. So that's all I'll say.
Final point, Ivana?
Yes, I completely agree with Jasmin, and since I also live here, I am also very worried, and it's not an easy feeling, you know, when you, especially when you run an organization that deals with anti-corruption, and then you have these kinds of crises, and then you can't actually push for any kind of reform or anything to happen because everything is blocked due to these kinds of artificially created crises or something that just happens. And I'm really worried specifically about these kinds of, you know, little situations. Somebody will go to a village somewhere and do something, and then people will gather around it, and the escalation might be larger than any of the politicians who sparked this actually intended to happen. But it's usually like this. I mean, this would not be the first time, but this time nobody would. There is nobody here. When we talk about domestic politicians who are now in power, who can calm things down. And that's the difference between some other maybe incidents that we had in the past, where, you know, people from all sides would be normal about it and try to de-escalate the situation. I'm not sure that this would happen now, because what we see here also is that even from Bosniak side, you have the media who push for this issue of war constantly. Like sometimes you have a feeling that, you know, we were announcing that this would happen, so we are now right, or we would be glad if that kind of things happen just so that we can be right. I mean, and this is kind of, I think, and misinformation that is going on as well from all sides that can be very dangerous, like people distributing guns in Republika Srpska, or, you know, some other information that appears also in the mainstream media. But my final point is actually, yes, the international community needs to keep close attention to what is going on, but we cannot constantly and forever expect for the international community to solve our problems. And this is something that we've been doing for more than 20 years. You know, whatever happens, okay, they will solve the problem because the politicians won't. So we look at them like some kind of saviors. Any member of the individual member of the international community has their own interests. And we have to have that in mind, including Russia, that might stop supporting Dodik if it's in their interest, or including some other countries that we are looking to solve all of our problems and help us. So, yeah.
That was great. Kurt, did you have a final comment? Or
I want to pick up on something Ivana said, because I think this is true. I mean, the outer limits of what liberal external actors can do is create a more conducive environment for citizens of BIH to create an alternative. We can't fix it. We can make it much more possible for those of you who are Bosnians and Herzegovinians who want to fix it, but that's where we're failing. I mean, the only de-escalation that needs to happen is to say, we're not going to allow violence, and anybody who tries to employ violence is going to really regret it very quickly. That is something that is completely within our power to do, and that is where we're failing. And instead, we seem to be using things like our anti-corruption tools, like the Russians use Kompromat, to try to use it for tactical and instrumental purposes, rather than use it like a lawnmower to decapitate the entire political elite of the Western Balkans, which is what we should do. But that would be destabilizing. Well, progress required is not stability. And we can control for the most dangerous aspects of instability, and we're not doing it. So there's a potential upside here. But it is very dangerous right now because there's no net, and we're the ones who are supposed to be holding it.
Okay, I think we'll end there. We had some great discussion, some great insights from different perspectives, great policy recommendations and warnings. And I want to thank all the panelists for taking time out on Friday afternoon to be here. And we had a pretty large group in the audience and some really great questions. If your question didn't get answered, you know, maybe you can contact one of the participants if you have a burning question that didn't get answered, and see if they can make time for that. Thanks again to UNC and the Forum on Southeast Europe for organizing. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.